There was a voicemail waiting for me when I got off my shift. My mother's voice, warm the way it only gets when she wants something. "Sweetheart, Thanksgiving this year. We're doing it at Grandma Elspeth's. The whole family. Everyone's coming. Don't make other plans." I stood in the hospital parking lot in Sudbury, still in my scrubs, November air cutting straight through the fabric, and I listened to that message twice. The whole family. Everyone's coming. I should have felt something good when I heard that. Most people do, I think, when they imagine a house full of cousins and the smell of turkey and their grandmother's butter tarts cooling on the counter. I used to feel that. There was a time, but I'd been doing this long enough being my entire adult life, to notice what the message didn't say. It didn't say we miss you. It didn't say we want you there. It said don't make other plans. Like I was being penciled into someone else's schedule, like showing up was an obligation I owed them rather than something any of them had earned. I called back and said I'd be there. Of course I did. My grandmother lived about 40 minutes outside of Sudbury, on a property she and my grandfather had bought in the late 70s, when land in that part of Ontario was still affordable for a couple who ran a small plumbing supply business out of a rented unit on the edge of town. Grandpa passed when I was 11. I barely remember him except for his hands, which were enormous, and the way he always smelled like coffee and sawdust. Grandma Elspeth kept the business going after he died. She hired people, learned the accounts herself, drove to job sites when she had to. Nobody expected her to manage it. She managed it for another 18 years before she sold it and retired. I knew she had money. Our family knew she had money. It was one of those things everyone understood but nobody discussed directly, like a piece of furniture in the middle of the room that everyone walks around without acknowledging. My mother and her sister, my Aunt Cordelia, had strong opinions about how Grandma should spend her time, her energy, her health decisions, her diet. They showed up every few months to rearrange her kitchen and tell her the house was too big for one person. What they did not do, as far as I could tell, was simply sit with her. I did that, not because I had some plan. I just liked her. She was funny in this dry, unhurried way that caught you off guard. She had opinions about everything: municipal politics and the best way to store firewood, and whether people who used the term charcuterie board instead of just saying cheese plate were being pretentious. She watched curling on Saturday afternoons and genuinely cared about the outcome. I drove out to see her maybe once a month. We'd have lunch. She'd make soup from scratch, the kind that takes 4 hours, and we'd sit at her kitchen table until the afternoon light went flat and gray, the way it does in northern Ontario in October. Those visits kept me sane during a year that was otherwise pretty brutal. I'd just ended a 3-year relationship. I was working overnight shifts. I was living alone in a 1-bedroom apartment that I could barely afford even on a registered nurse's salary, which is not, despite what people assume, a small salary. But everything costs what it costs. You know how it is? So when my mother left that voicemail about Thanksgiving, part of me was genuinely glad. A reason to go out there. A table full of people. Grandma's butter tarts. The smell of the house, which always smelled like wood smoke, and something baking. I took the Friday before Thanksgiving off. I packed a bag. I made the drive. The driveway was empty when I pulled in. That was the first thing. No cars. My mother drives a white SUV, and my aunt has a minivan, the color of a bruise. Neither of them was there. I checked my phone. No messages. I sat in my car for a moment, with the engine running, heat blowing, watching the front window of the house for movement. The door opened before I got to the porch. My grandmother stood in the frame in her cardigan and her wool socks, and she looked at me, and then she looked past me at the driveway, and then she looked at me again. "Just you," she said. "Just me," I said. "Where is everyone?" She was quiet for a second in the way she gets when she's choosing her words carefully. which is different from the way she gets when she simply has nothing to say. She stepped back and let me in. On the kitchen counter there was a sticky note in my mother's handwriting. Something came up with the Tremblay's place in Mont Tremblant. We'll call Sunday. Megan can help with whatever you need. Enjoy. I read it twice. Megan. That's me. My mother had driven 4 hours to Mont Tremblant for the long weekend with my aunt and uncle, and my cousin Brent, and Brent's new girlfriend, whose name I could never remember because she'd only been around for 4 months, and nobody had thought to introduce her to me properly. They had rented a chalet. There were photos on Instagram already. My cousin had posted a reel of himself doing something with a fire pit, and the caption said, "Grateful." My grandmother put the kettle on. She didn't say anything for a while. I stood at the counter reading that sticky note over and over, not because I didn't understand it. I understood it completely, but because some part of me kept expecting it to say something different if I just gave it enough time. I thought it was a family gathering, I finally said. So did I, she said. She poured the tea. We sat down. Here's what the next 4 days looked like. Friday. We raked leaves in the backyard. My grandmother has about 3/4 of an acre, and there is a row of old maples along the back fence that drop an unreasonable amount of leaves every fall. We raked for 2 hours and filled 11 bags. She made chili for dinner. We watched the news and then a documentary about the St. Lawrence Seaway that she'd recorded months ago and never gotten around to. She fell asleep in her chair around 9 and I covered her with the blanket that lives on the arm of the sofa. And I sat there in the quiet house thinking about nothing in particular. Saturday, she wanted to go to the farmer's market in town, the one that runs until the end of October. We drove in. She bought squash and a jar of local honey and a loaf of sourdough from a young guy who recognized her from when she used to supply pipe fittings to his father's construction company back in the 90s. They talked for 10 minutes. I stood to the side and watched her, the way her face opened up when she was talking to someone she actually knew. That expression. I don't see it often enough. Saturday afternoon, she had a physiotherapy appointment for her hip, which she'd been putting off mentioning to me because she didn't want me to make it a thing. I drove her. The physiotherapist went through her exercises with her and printed out a sheet, and on the drive home, my grandmother told me she was supposed to be doing those exercises every morning and had been doing them roughly, never. We made a deal. I'd call her every morning at 9 and she'd do them while we talked. She agreed, which surprised me. Usually she negotiates. Sunday turkey. We made it together. She does the stuffing the old-fashioned way. Bread and celery and sage, no shortcuts. I did the potatoes and the green beans and the gravy. We ate at her dining room table with the good dishes, just the two of us. And she poured us each a small glass of red wine, and we said what we were thankful for, which is something she's done every Thanksgiving since before I was born, and insists on even when it makes people uncomfortable. I said I was thankful for her. She looked at me over her wine glass for a moment, and then she said, "You're the only one of them who comes." I didn't say anything. She didn't elaborate. We finished dinner and she washed and I dried and we listened to CBC radio because that's what she always does. Monday, Thanksgiving Day, she wasn't feeling well. Nothing serious, she said it was just fatigue, that she'd overdone it with the yard work. I made her stay on the couch. I made soup. I checked her over the way you do when you're a nurse and the person in front of you is 79 years old and you're trying not to let your professional brain start generating worst-case scenarios. Her color was fine. Her breathing was fine. She was just tired. She slept most of the afternoon. I sat in the armchair by the window and watched the light change on the backyard and thought about calling my mother. I picked up my phone 3 times. I put it down 3 times. There was nothing to say that wouldn't become an argument, and Grandma Elspeth was sleeping 20 feet away, and some things can wait. My mother called that evening. Cheerful, breezy, full of Mont Tremblant. Had I had a nice drive out? Was Grandma doing okay? She and my aunt had found the most incredible little bistro. You wouldn't believe the menu. She wasn't feeling well today, I said. Oh, she's always saying that. You know how she is. I didn't respond to that. Well, we'll be back on Wednesday, my mother said. We'll pop by and see her then. Pop by. A 4-day Thanksgiving weekend and they'd pop by. Okay, I said. You're not upset, are you? We figured you'd enjoy the quiet time with her. You two are always thick as thieves. I'm not upset, I said. That wasn't true. But the feeling underneath upset, the one that had been sitting in my chest since I read that sticky note on Friday, was something older and heavier than anger. It was more like recognition. Like finally seeing clearly something you'd been squinting at for years. I drove back to Sudbury on Tuesday morning. Grandma walked me to my car. It was cold, properly cold. The kind of November cold that means it and isn't going away. She was in her cardigan, and I told her to go back inside, and she ignored me completely because she always does. She hugged me at the car. A real hug. The kind where you can tell someone is actually holding on. Call me Thursday, she said. After 9. For the exercises, I said. For the exercises, she agreed. I drove back, through grey-green northern Ontario, through the towns with the Tim Hortons and the Canadian Tires, and the turnoffs to lakes with names in Ojibwe that most people down south can't pronounce. And I thought about my grandmother alone in that house with the fire going and the documentary she'd been meaning to watch. And I thought about my mother at a bistro in Mont Tremblant. And I thought about the sticky note, and at some point I stopped thinking about any of it and just drove. 6 months later, in April, I got a call from a lawyer's office in Sudbury. My grandmother had named me as executor of her estate. I didn't know this. She had never mentioned it. The lawyer, a methodical woman named after a river. I remember thinking that when I first heard her surname, explained that my grandmother had updated her will the previous December. Approximately 6 weeks after Thanksgiving. She had done it quietly with her existing lawyer, without telling anyone. I sat in my car in the hospital parking lot again. Different shift, same parking lot. Listening to this information being delivered in the careful, neutral tone that lawyers use when they are telling you something significant. My grandmother had passed 3 weeks earlier. A stroke. Fast. At home. By the time the ambulance arrived, there was nothing to be done. I had spoken to her on the phone the morning it happened. We did her hip exercises. She complained about a city councillor. She said she'd been sleeping better. I keep thinking about that morning. The ordinary texture of it. The estate, the lawyer explained, was more substantial than most people in the family had realized. The sale of the business in 2001 had brought in approximately $2.1 million. My grandmother had invested conservatively through a Sudbury financial advisory firm, primarily in Canadian dividend stocks and government bonds, reinvesting returns for over 2 decades. The property itself, the house and the 3/4 acre, had appreciated considerably. Assessed value of the estate at time of death, just under $4.8 million, not counting personal property. $4.8 million. I wrote that number down on a receipt I found in my cuff holder because I needed to see it on paper to believe it. My grandmother had left my mother and Aunt Cordelia $150,000 each, outright. She had left my cousin Brent $75,000, specifically earmarked in the will, for practical use at his discretion. She had left various smaller amounts to 2 local charities she'd supported for decades. The Sudbury Food Bank and a literacy program she'd volunteered with in her 60s. The remainder of the estate, the house, the investments, everything else, she had left to me. My mother found out on a Thursday. I know it was a Thursday because I was at work, and I had specifically asked the lawyer to contact the family by mail to give everyone time to process the information before we spoke. I thought that was the considerate approach. I was trying to be thoughtful. My mother did not appreciate the thoughtfulness. She called at 11:17 in the morning while I was charting. I let it go to voicemail. She called again at 11:22. Then my aunt called. Then my mother again. I was at work. And there was a patient who needed me, and I could not stand in the hallway of a hospital unit fielding calls about an inheritance. So I turned my phone over and I finished my shift. I listened to the voicemails in the parking lot at 7 in the evening with the car running and the heat on. My mother's voice was not warm this time. She wanted to know what had happened. She wanted to know what I had said to Grandma Elspeth. She wanted to know what I had said to Grandma Elspeth. She wanted to know how this was possible. She said the word unfair 4 times in the first message alone. In the second message, she said that Grandma must not have been in her right mind, that she was going to look into it, that this wasn't over. My aunt's message was shorter and colder. She said she expected a call. I sat with the phone in my lap for a long time. Then I called the lawyer back and told her I was ready to proceed with the estate administration. The legal process took the better part of 8 months. My mother did consult another lawyer. That lawyer reviewed the will and the documentation of my grandmother's mental competency. Her physician had assessed her that December, routinely, and found her sharp, oriented, fully capable, and advised my mother that there were no grounds for a challenge. My grandmother had known exactly what she was doing and had documented it carefully. She had not been influenced or manipulated. She had made a decision. My mother stopped speaking to me for 4 months. My aunt sent an email in January that was 6 paragraphs long and used the word betrayal 3 times. I read it once and did not respond. My cousin Brent texted me in February, out of nowhere, to say he hoped I was doing okay. Just that. I stared at that text for a while. I texted back that I was doing okay and asked how he was. He said fine. That was the whole conversation, and somehow it was the kindest interaction I'd had with anyone in my family in 6 months. I kept the house. A lot of people, when I tell them this, assume I sold it. They assume I took the money and moved somewhere. That's the practical choice, and I'm a practical person. And Sudbury is a long drive from that property, and I work long shifts, and owning a house you don't live in is complicated and expensive. All of that is true. But I'd raked those leaves. I'd sat at that kitchen table through 100 ordinary afternoons. I knew where she kept the extra wool blankets and which window sticks shut in July and which burner on the stove runs hot. I knew the good dishes were in the cabinet above the fridge, and the butter tart recipe was in a handwritten notebook in the second drawer on the left. I took a job in a smaller hospital closer to the property. Better hours, honest work. A team I liked from the first week. I moved in on a Saturday in early spring, when the maples were just starting to come back and the backyard still had that pale, recovering look it gets before things fully wake up. The first morning I was there, I made coffee and stood at the kitchen window and did the hip exercises, both sets, the whole routine. It took 11 minutes. Then I called nobody, because there was nobody to call. And I just stood there in the quiet with my coffee, while the yard slowly filled up with April light. My mother called in March, 7 months after the will was read. Her voice was different, not warm, not the Monttremblant voice, not the version I'd been getting in those early voicemails full of accusations and the word unfair. Just tired. Like someone who'd been carrying something heavy for too long and had finally decided to put it down, not because the grievance was gone, but because she didn't have the strength for it anymore. She said she was sorry about Grandma. She said she missed her. I said I was sorry too. I said I missed her too. We talked for 20 minutes about nothing in particular. My aunt's kitchen renovation. A pothole on the highway between here and Sudbury that nobody had fixed in 3 years. Whether the weather had been strange lately, or whether this was just what November was like and she was forgetting. She did not mention the will. I did not mention the sticky note. We said goodbye and I stood in the kitchen of my grandmother's house. My house now, though that still lands strangely. And I looked at the second drawer on the left, which I haven't opened yet. And I thought about the butter tart recipe inside it, and I thought maybe this weekend I'd try. Not to have something to show anyone, not to post about it anywhere. Just because she knew how, and now I want to know how, and that feels like enough of a reason. I've thought a lot about what actually happened in that house over those 4 days. Not the inheritance. That came later, and it still doesn't feel entirely real. I mean what happened in the smaller sense. The raking, the farmer's market, the physiotherapy appointment Grandma Elspeth had been putting off mentioning because she didn't want me to fuss. The turkey we made together with the stuffing from scratch. None of it was dramatic. That's the thing nobody tells you about the moments that end up mattering. They don't announce themselves. They just look like an ordinary Saturday in November. You and your grandmother buying squash from a man who remembered her from 30 years ago, standing to the side watching her face open up. The way it only does around people she actually knows. I didn't go out there to be good. I didn't stay to earn anything. I stayed because she was there and she needed company and I genuinely wanted to be in that kitchen. That's it. No calculation behind it. But I think Grandma Elspeth understood something I was still learning, which is that how people spend their time is the most honest thing about them, not what they say at Christmas dinner, or what they post online, or what they promise when it's convenient. Just, where do they actually show up? Whose door do they actually knock on? Who do they call at 9 in the morning? Not because there's a crisis, but because they said they would. My mother and my aunt had a story about themselves. Devoted daughters, involved family, people who cared. And maybe they believed it. But the sticky note on the counter told a different story. And Grandma Elspeth, who had spent 40 years running a business and managing accounts and driving to job sites alone after my grandfather died, knew the difference between a story and the truth. She didn't change her will to punish anyone. I don't think that's what it was. I think she just decided, clearly and without drama, to leave what she'd built to the person who had actually been there. That's not punishment. That's just accuracy. What I've come to understand. Slowly, in the months of silence from my mother, in the cold email from my aunt, in my cousin Brent's unexpected 2-line text, is that integrity doesn't protect you from consequences. It doesn't make people treat you fairly or ensure that things work out the way they should. A lot of the time, it costs you something. It cost me 4 days of my Thanksgiving weekend and a year of uncomfortable family silence, and the ongoing low-grade grief of knowing that my mother and I may never fully find our way back to each other. But I live in a house where I know which window sticks in July. I know where the wool blankets are kept. I know the butter tart recipe is in the second drawer on the left, in a notebook in my grandmother's handwriting, waiting for me whenever I'm ready. Nobody gave me that. I just showed up, consistently, for years, without knowing it would ever amount to anything. And I think that's the only version of this story that I could actually live with. That I was there because I wanted to be, not because I was angling for something. The people who calculate tend to miscalculate. The people who simply show up tend to end up, eventually, exactly where they were supposed to be. I'm still figuring out what that means for me. But I do the hip exercises every morning. Both sets, the whole routine, 11 minutes. I started doing them too while I talk to nobody in the quiet of a house that smells like wood smoke and something I haven't yet learned to bake. That feels like a start.